The night had already begun to settle, casting a deep purple hue across the quiet suburban streets. The headlights of Jamal's car cut through the darkness as he drove along the road, the sound of his tires humming on the asphalt. He had just finished a long day at work, long hours at a warehouse, lifting heavy boxes, sorting inventory. He looked forward to getting home, putting his feet up and watching a game on TV. Maybe a cold beer to unwind. It had been an exhausting week, and the thought of relaxation brought a small sense of peace to his tired mind. As Jamal rounded a corner, he noticed a flash of light in his rearview mirror. It was the unmistakable red and blue of a police siren, flashing in his mirror. His stomach tightened instantly. "Damn," Jamal muttered to himself, his fingers gripping the steering wheel just a little tighter. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run a light. His car was in good condition. But still, that knot in his gut never loosened when he saw those flashing lights. He had been pulled over before, but never without feeling like something wasn't quite right. It was a feeling he had come to know all too well over the years. He checked his rearview mirror again, trying to gauge the officer's demeanor. The police car was close, tailing him just a little too closely, even for a traffic stop. Jamal slowed down and pulled his car to the side of the road, turning off his engine and waiting for the officer to approach. He knew the drill: hands on the wheel, be polite, avoid confrontation. The officer stepped out of the squad car. Jamal took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, watching as the figure of the officer grew closer. He was tall and broad-shouldered, a white man with a crew cut and the hard eyes of someone who had seen a lot of bad in the world. His uniform was crisp, with a nameplate that read, "Officer Matthews." As Matthews approached, Jamal could feel the tension building. His palms were sweaty. He had done nothing wrong, but he couldn't shake the sense that tonight, the encounter was going to be different. He had heard the stories, seen the news, and experienced firsthand the subtle ways that people like him were treated by law enforcement. Even if he kept his hands visible, stayed calm, and followed all the rules, there was still that voice in the back of his head telling him to be careful. "Good evening, officer," Jamal said, trying to sound as calm as possible. Matthews didn't acknowledge the greeting. His eyes moved over Jamal's car with a critical, almost predatory gaze before they landed on Jamal himself. He didn't smile. In fact, he didn't seem to acknowledge Jamal at all as a person. He simply stood there, staring at him with a look that made Jamal feel like he was under a microscope. "You know why I pulled you over?" Matthews asked, his voice gruff and flat. Jamal hesitated. "No, officer, I don't. I wasn't speeding, and there's nothing wrong with my car. Is there a problem?" Matthews looked at him for a moment, as though assessing whether he should answer or not. The silence stretched on. Jamal felt his heart rate pick up, the tension thick in the air. "Let me see your license and registration," Matthews said, his voice a little colder now. Jamal, a little confused by the lack of explanation, nodded and reached for his glove compartment. As he moved, he noticed Matthews step closer, his hand hovering near his belt, close to his gun. Jamal froze for a second, but then continued reaching for the documents. His hands trembled slightly as he handed Matthews the paperwork. He had lived in this city his whole life, never been in trouble, always followed the rules. But somehow, he knew that tonight, something was different. Matthews glanced at the documents and then handed them back without saying a word. Jamal took them, feeling the officer's gaze on him the entire time, a heavy and uncomfortable pressure that made him feel like he was being judged for something beyond his driving. "Step out of the vehicle," Matthews ordered abruptly. Jamal blinked, caught off guard by the command. "Wait, what? Why?" "I said step out of the vehicle," Matthews repeated, his voice growing sterner. Jamal's mind raced. He didn't want to cause any trouble, but this was starting to feel more like an interrogation than a routine stop. His mind went over the options quickly. Could he refuse? Should he ask again what was going on? Was this just a routine stop, or was there something else happening here? "I don't understand," Jamal said, trying to stay calm, his voice shaky but controlled. "What's the reason for pulling me over? Why do I need to step out?" Matthews took a step closer, his face now inches away from Jamal's. He was now fully in control of the situation, and he was using that power to intimidate. "You don't get to ask questions," Matthews said, his voice cold. "I'm the one in charge here. Step out of the vehicle." Jamal felt a knot tighten in his stomach, the tension rising. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone else. A witness, maybe, someone who could see what was happening, but the street was empty. He could feel his pulse quicken, the fear creeping up his spine. Was this really happening? Still, he tried to keep his composure. "I'm just asking why I'm being stopped," he said, his voice quieter now, more cautious. "I haven't done anything wrong." Matthew's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "Do you want me to get the backup here?" he asked, his voice dripping with menace. Jamal's breath hitched. He knew exactly what this meant. The situation could escalate quickly. He could see it in Matthews's eyes, the barely concealed animosity, the way he seemed to be looking for a reason to escalate things. "Fine," Jamal said finally, his hands shaking as he opened the door of the car. He could feel his legs tremble slightly as he stepped out, trying to maintain control over his own body. His mind raced with questions. Why was he being treated like this? Why did the officer seem so intent on pushing him? But in the back of his mind, Jamal knew one thing for certain. He was a black man. And this was a moment where his presence in this neighborhood, the mere fact that he existed in this space, was enough to make Matthews feel justified in his actions. Matthews didn't give Jamal any space. The officer's next words were sharp and commanding. "Hands on the hood." Jamal hesitated for a second, but then complied, his mind still racing. He didn't want to provoke Matthews further, but something about the situation felt off. The officer's behavior wasn't about the traffic stop. It was about something deeper, something racial. As Jamal stood there, hands on the hood of the car, the knot in his stomach grew tighter. He couldn't shake the feeling that the night was about to turn very ugly. Would this be just another encounter with the police? Or was it something worse? Jamal didn't know yet, but the answer was coming fast. Jamal kept his hands on the hood of the car, his palms flat against the cool metal, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had been pulled over countless times before, but this was different. This officer, Officer Matthews, wasn't just conducting a routine traffic stop. He was making Jamal feel like a criminal, like his very presence in this neighborhood was something to be questioned, scrutinized, and ultimately punished. Matthews stood behind him, silent for a few moments, seemingly taking pleasure in the control he had over the situation. Jamal could hear the officer's boots scrape against the pavement. As Matthews shifted his stance, moving in closer, his presence looming like a shadow. The hairs on the back of Jamal's neck stood up, a sense of foreboding creeping through him. "You know, I don't like when people waste my time," Matthews finally said, his voice smooth but laced with an edge of authority that made Jamal bristle. "I'm not wasting your time," Jamal replied, his voice steady, though the tightness in his chest betrayed his nerves. "I'm just trying to understand why I was pulled over." Matthews took another step closer, almost within arm's reach now. Jamal could feel the officer's breath on the back of his neck, like an invisible weight pressing down. It was as if Matthews had nothing but contempt for him, for his very existence. "That's the problem right there," Matthews said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you have the right to ask questions. You don't. You're being stopped because I say so. That's all you need to know. Now stop asking." Jamal's mind raced, trying to grasp what was happening. He wasn't asking for much, just an explanation. But the more he tried to reason with Matthews, the more it became clear that this was no longer about a simple traffic stop. It was about power, the officer's power, the power to make someone feel small, to belittle them with the weight of his uniform and badge. "I'm just asking to understand why," Jamal started, but Matthews cut him off, raising his voice. "Don't talk back to me," Matthews barked. "You think you can come into this neighborhood and question me like you're some kind of authority. I don't have to explain myself to you." The words struck Jamal like a slap. He swallowed hard, trying to push back the rising anger. But the officer wasn't done. "Do you know how many people I've dealt with who think they can just talk back to me?" Matthews continued, his voice rising with each word. "People like you. You think you're above the law. Think I don't know what you're up to." Jamal's chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat. The officer's words were like daggers, and they cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He wasn't just being accused of a traffic violation. He was being accused of something more, something invisible, something intangible. Being black in this neighborhood, in this city, in this moment, was enough to paint him as a suspect, as someone who didn't belong. "I haven't done anything wrong," Jamal said, the words coming out more out of frustration than anything else. "I'm just trying to get home." Matthews stepped closer, his boots scraping against the ground again, his voice low and threatening. "You don't get to talk. You don't get to tell me what's right and wrong." Matthews hissed, his tone cold, deliberate. "You want to waste my time with questions? Fine, I'll waste yours." Jamal could feel the tension crackling in the air between them. His body felt heavy, as if it were being weighed down by an invisible force. He knew that Matthews was using this power dynamic to break him, to push him into submission. But Jamal wasn't going to just stand there and take it. "I'm not going to just let you do whatever you want to me," Jamal said, his voice a little firmer now, though still full of uncertainty. "I have rights." Matthews chuckled darkly, the sound of it sending a chill down Jamal's spine. "You think your rights matter here?" The officer's voice was almost mocking, as though Jamal's words were a joke. "You don't get to play the rights card with me, not when you're the one who's in the wrong." Jamal's frustration boiled over. He turned slightly, trying to face Matthews, but the officer stepped in front of him, blocking his view. The sheer arrogance of the officer's movements made Jamal's skin crawl. He was trapped. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to turn. Matthews was in control, and he made sure to remind Jamal of it with every step, every word. "You don't get to question me," Matthews repeated. "Not in my town, not in my jurisdiction. You're lucky I'm even giving you the time of day. You're lucky I haven't put you in cuffs yet." Jamal's blood ran cold at those words. He had heard about this before, stories of black men being arrested for nothing, thrown into the back of police cars, hauled away on trumped-up charges just because an officer felt like it. Was he really about to become one of those stories? Was this how it was going to end? Right here, in the middle of the street, with a racist officer abusing his power. A surge of anger ran through him. He wasn't going to just sit there and let Matthews push him around. He couldn't. He had to stand up for himself, even if it meant risking everything. "Why are you doing this?" Jamal asked, his voice louder now, filled with frustration and disbelief. "What did I do to you?" Matthews didn't flinch. His eyes hardened, and for a moment, Jamal saw something darker flicker in them. Matthews took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, it was with a quiet menace that made Jamal's stomach twist. "You didn't do anything to me," Matthews said slowly, as though savoring the words. "But you did something to me the moment you pulled into this neighborhood. People like you, they don't belong here. I don't want you here." The words hit Jamal like a physical blow. He felt the color drain from his face as Matthews's true intent became clear. This wasn't just about a traffic stop. This was about something deeper, something Jamal had known, but never had to confront so directly. Officer Matthews saw Jamal as a threat, simply because of his skin color. The realization stung, but Jamal refused to let it break him. He couldn't. "I'm not going anywhere," Jamal said through gritted teeth, his voice steady despite the fear curling in his stomach. "And I'm not leaving until I understand what's happening here." Matthews smiled, a tight, dangerous smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice cold and final. "Now, I told you. Hands back on the hood." Jamal slowly moved his hands back to the car, his mind racing. He knew he was being baited. He knew Matthews was waiting for him to make a mistake, to give him an excuse. But Jamal wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Not this time. The officer's power had always been about intimidation, about forcing people like Jamal to shrink, to bend, to back down. But Jamal wasn't backing down. Not this time. The night air grew colder as Jamal stood with his hands pressed firmly against the hood of his car, the weight of Officer Matthews's presence bearing down on him like a physical force. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, trying to find a way out of this moment that didn't end with him being dragged into a squad car, or worse. "Hands on the hood," Matthews repeated, his tone flat and authoritative, his words like an ironclad command. It was as though Jamal's mere attempt to challenge him, to ask for an explanation, had only cemented his suspicion. Jamal wasn't cooperating the way Matthews expected, and for that, Jamal would be punished. Jamal's pulse quickened, but he obeyed, pressing his palms back against the cold metal of the car. His body was stiff, his muscles taut with the tension that had been building since the moment Matthews had first pulled him over. Every breath felt labored as the officer circled around him, looming in his peripheral vision. "You're wasting my time," Matthews muttered, his voice low, almost like a growl. He was a predator now, circling, waiting for the smallest sign of weakness to strike. Jamal swallowed hard, refusing to let fear take over. But as he tried to steady his breathing, Matthews spoke again, and this time there was no mistaking the malice in his words. "You think you can just question me, huh? Think you're above the law?" Matthews stepped closer, his boots scraping against the asphalt as he moved toward Jamal. "I'm giving you one last chance. You step back into line, and we can forget all this." Jamal clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not for this. Not for an officer who was clearly abusing his power. His voice, calm but firm, cut through the tension. "I'm not doing anything wrong, officer," Jamal said, trying his best to sound reasonable, even though the situation was far from it. "I just want to understand why I was pulled over. I'm trying to comply, but I need some clarity." Matthews was having none of it. He stepped in front of Jamal, his body blocking his view of the street, his broad frame casting a shadow over Jamal's smaller, more vulnerable one. The officer's face was a mask of cold contempt. "Enough with the questions," Matthews snapped. "You're done talking. I said hands on the hood, and that's all you need to do." Jamal's heart raced as he stared ahead, trying to block out the sense of dread that was crawling up his spine. He could feel Matthews's hostility seeping into every word, every command. The officer wasn't just enforcing the law. He was trying to break Jamal. He was trying to remind Jamal of his place. "I haven't done anything to deserve this," Jamal muttered, his voice rising slightly, a mix of anger and disbelief. "You're harassing me." Matthew's expression hardened in an instant, and Jamal knew, even before the officer spoke, what was coming next. "Harassing," Matthews repeated, his voice dark with sarcasm. "You want to talk about harassment? You're the one who's wasting my time. You want to make this harder on yourself? Fine. You can keep talking all you want, but you're not going anywhere until I say so." Jamal's stomach sank as the reality of the situation hit him. This wasn't going to end well. Officer Matthews wasn't interested in listening or reasoning. He was interested in asserting dominance, in making sure Jamal understood exactly who was in control. Before Jamal could say anything else, Matthews snapped his fingers at him. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Jamal froze. His breath caught in his throat. "What? What are you doing? I haven't done anything." His voice cracked, but he refused to show fear. Matthews didn't respond. He moved quickly, too quickly, reaching for his handcuffs with one swift motion. His hands were rough, methodical, as he grabbed Jamal's wrist and yanked it behind his back, tightening the metal cuffs around his wrists before Jamal could fully comprehend what was happening. "Stop resisting," Matthews barked, tightening the cuffs even further, making Jamal wince in pain. "I'm not resisting," Jamal said, trying to shift his weight to ease the pressure, but Matthews pushed him harder against the hood of the car. "You're hurting me. I haven't done anything. What are you arresting me for?" Matthews didn't answer. Instead, he shoved Jamal's chest with his knee, forcing him further into the car. "You've got an attitude problem. That's what you're getting arrested for," Matthews said, his words slow and deliberate, like he was savoring the moment. Jamal felt his pulse pounding in his ears, his vision narrowing as his heart raced. He could hardly believe what was happening. The cuffs were biting into his skin, too tight, too painful, and all for what? For asking a question, for trying to make sense of a situation that made no sense at all. "Stop struggling," Matthews warned, his voice icy. "You're not going anywhere." Jamal's thoughts swirled with frustration. This was an abuse of power, pure and simple. There was no reason for him to be cuffed, no reason for this officer to escalate things. The situation should have been over by now, but Jamal knew that it wasn't going to end like that, not while Officer Matthews held the power. Jamal took a deep breath and did his best to calm his racing mind. The officer had no right to treat him like this. He was being arrested for nothing. He had the right to question it, to challenge it. But the fact that Matthews didn't care about his rights, that he was willing to push Jamal this far just to assert his dominance, filled him with a rage that threatened to boil over. "Get in the car," Matthews ordered, jerking Jamal forward and guiding him toward the squad car. Jamal stumbled slightly, still disoriented from the rough handling, but he did as he was told. He had no choice. As Matthews opened the back door of the squad car, Jamal could feel the weight of the situation sinking in. He had been taken from a simple traffic stop, an ordinary part of his day, and now he was being shoved into the back of a police car, handcuffed, for nothing more than questioning a procedure that felt wrong. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. His chest tightened with anger and disbelief, and though he was furious, part of him felt hopeless. He had tried to do everything right. He had tried to comply, to be reasonable, but it hadn't mattered. Jamal sat down in the back of the squad car, the cold metal of the seat pressing against his legs. He glanced out of the window, watching as Officer Matthews slammed the door shut. The sirens cut through the night, the flashing lights a sickening reminder of how powerless he felt in that moment. As the car sped off, Jamal's thoughts shifted toward one thing. He needed to speak to someone higher up. This wasn't right. He wasn't going to let this go. But even as he clutched the seat, trying to steady his breathing, Jamal couldn't shake the fear that this was just the beginning. The sound of the squad car's engine humming and the rhythmic sway of the vehicle as it sped through the streets did little to calm Jamal. His wrists burned from the tightness of the handcuffs, and the confined space of the back seat pressed down on him, amplifying his sense of helplessness. Despite his best efforts to control his anger, it was beginning to simmer beneath the surface, threatening to explode. The car made a sharp turn, the tires screeching as they cut across the intersection, and Jamal was thrown back against the seat, his body jolting from the sudden movement. He clenched his teeth, forcing himself to breathe steadily, but every breath felt heavy with frustration and disbelief. How had he gone from asking simple questions to being carted off in the back of a squad car, arrested for absolutely nothing? The silence in the car was suffocating. There was nothing but the sound of the engine and the occasional radio crackle. Jamal couldn't get the image of Officer Matthews out of his mind. The way he'd sneered, the way he'd made Jamal feel so small, so insignificant, as though he didn't have the right to question his actions. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours before the car finally came to a stop. The tires squealed again as they hit the curb, the screeching sound leaving an unsettling echo in Jamal's head. Officer Matthews didn't even acknowledge Jamal as he got out of the car. The door slammed shut, and Jamal's world, once again, narrowed to the cold, sterile confines of the vehicle. A few minutes later, Matthews returned, his boots heavy on the ground, the distinct sound of them thudding against the pavement signaling his approach. He didn't say a word as he unlocked the door and opened it, pulling Jamal out roughly by the arm, guiding him through the parking lot toward the building. "You're going to speak to someone who can straighten you out," Matthews muttered, more to himself than to Jamal. The building was a small police station on the outskirts of the city, a typical nondescript structure with plain concrete walls and flickering lights, the kind of place where bad things could easily be brushed under the rug, hidden away in dark corners, and forgotten by the public. Jamal had been here before, on the few occasions that he had to report an incident or file a complaint. He had never felt like it was a safe place, but now, as Matthews led him toward the entrance, it felt more like a cage. Jamal's stomach tightened as Matthews escorted him inside, leading him down a dimly lit hallway toward a small office near the back. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and something less identifiable, like stale cigarettes. As they neared the door, Matthews knocked once, briefly, before opening it without waiting for a response. Inside, the dim light cast a faint glow over the man sitting at the desk. The officer looked up briefly, his face unreadable, before he stood up, his posture stiff, formal. "Sergeant Taylor," Matthews said, his tone now filled with a kind of deferential respect that Jamal hadn't heard from him all night. "This is the suspect. He's been difficult. Jamal's gut twisted at the word suspect. He was not a suspect. He was not a criminal. But Matthews had already made up his mind about that, and now it seemed like he was handing him off to someone who would back up his story, who would continue the charade. The man behind the desk, Sergeant Taylor, didn't seem particularly surprised to see Jamal. His face was hard, his jaw tight, but there was something else in his eyes, something calculating, something that suggested he had already made up his mind about what kind of person Jamal was before they even exchanged a word. "All right, Matthews, you can leave us now," Taylor said, his voice calm and measured. Matthews nodded once, then turned and left the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Jamal stood there for a moment, still in handcuffs, feeling more isolated than ever. He had no idea what this supervisor would do, whether he was going to be any different from Matthews. But he had to try. He had to speak up. He had to make someone listen. "Officer," Jamal said, his voice tight, "I need to speak to someone. Someone who can help me understand what's going on here. I've done nothing wrong. I don't deserve to be arrested like this." Sergeant Taylor studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly before he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He didn't speak for a long time, just looked at Jamal with that cold, scrutinizing gaze, like he was weighing him, deciding whether or not he was worth the effort. Finally, Taylor spoke, his voice low and almost too calm. "You know, you're not the first person to come in here claiming to be wrongfully arrested, and frankly, you won't be the last," Taylor said, his words dripping with condescension. "But what you fail to realize is that your kind," he paused, his words thickening with a hint of malice, "doesn't get the luxury of questioning anything. You don't get to talk back to officers, especially not when they're doing their jobs, not when they're making sure the streets stay safe." Jamal's blood ran cold, his chest constricted as Taylor's words settled in. It wasn't just Matthews who saw him as less than human. It wasn't just one officer. This entire station, this entire system, had already made up its mind about him, about people like him. They saw him as a threat because of the color of his skin. Jamal tried to steady his breath, but the anger inside him boiled over. He wanted to scream, to tell Taylor exactly what he thought of his words, but he knew that would only make things worse. This was a game, a power struggle, and right now, Jamal had no power at all. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Jamal managed to say, his voice shaking with anger and frustration. "I was just trying to understand what was happening. I wasn't being disrespectful. I wasn't doing anything wrong." Sergeant Taylor stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and took a step toward Jamal. His eyes narrowed as he leaned in close, the scent of coffee and cheap cologne wafting over Jamal as Taylor's face hovered inches from his own. "I know exactly what you're doing," Taylor said quietly, his voice cold and threatening. "You're trying to manipulate the system, trying to make yourself the victim when you're the one who's causing problems. You're not going to win here. Not with me, not with Matthews, not with anyone." Jamal's heart raced. He could feel the weight of Taylor's words pressing down on him, suffocating him. But he couldn't let it break him. Not now. He had to keep his composure, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much it felt like the entire world was stacked against him. "I want to file a formal complaint," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the rising storm of emotions within him. "I want to speak to someone higher up, someone who will listen." Taylor's lips curled into a thin smile, but it wasn't a smile that offered comfort or reassurance. It was a smile that said, Jamal was a problem to be dealt with, a nuisance that had no place in the system. "I'll take care of it," Taylor said, almost dismissively, his eyes still fixed on Jamal. "But you'll find that the higher-ups tend to agree with us. This isn't your fight to win." Jamal wanted to argue. He wanted to tell Taylor everything he had been through, to scream that he wasn't the criminal here. But deep down, Jamal knew what the outcome would likely be. The system was broken, and he was just another casualty in a long line of injustices. The days that followed felt like a blur to Jamal. His mind couldn't stop replaying the events of that night. The feeling of the handcuffs cutting into his skin, the cold stare of Officer Matthews, and the dismissive, almost sneering way Sergeant Taylor had treated him. He had been humiliated, stripped of his dignity, and yet all of it felt so unjust. He hadn't broken the law. He hadn't done anything wrong except for daring to challenge a system that saw him as nothing more than a target. But Jamal wasn't willing to let it go. He couldn't. He knew that if he did, the system would win, and people like him would continue to be mistreated, oppressed, and silenced. He filed the complaint, just like he'd told Taylor he would. He spent hours drafting a detailed account of everything that had happened that night. His stop, the way he'd been treated, the aggressive behavior of Officer Matthews, and the way Sergeant Taylor had responded when he tried to speak up. Jamal knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make his voice heard, even if it felt like he was shouting into the void. It wasn't long before the wheels of the system began to turn, slowly and with little regard for his dignity. An internal investigation was launched, barely a ripple in the ocean of police misconduct, but it was something. At first, Jamal was hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, this time, his complaint would lead to something real. But as the days turned into weeks, his optimism started to fade. The more he followed up, the more he realized that his case was being buried, ignored, and swept under the rug. Jamal's phone rang one afternoon, the name, Internal Affairs, flashing across the screen. His heart skipped a beat as he answered. "This is Jamal Williams," he said, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. "Mr. Williams, this is Officer Daniels from Internal Affairs," came the voice on the other end. "We've reviewed your case, and after a thorough investigation, we have reached a conclusion." Jamal's grip on the phone tightened, his pulse quickening. "And what is that conclusion?" There was a brief pause, and then the words came out, one after the other, flat and final. "Officer Matthews and Sergeant Taylor are being cleared of any wrongdoing." Jamal's world tilted on its axis. His mind screamed in disbelief, but the words were already sinking in, settling into a pit of hopelessness in his stomach. Cleared of any wrongdoing? After everything? After the way he had been treated? How? Jamal's voice cracked, but he didn't care. He was angry now, boiling over with frustration. "How is that possible? I've told you everything. They lied, "I'm afraid the evidence didn't support your claims," Officer Daniels interrupted, his tone polite but cold. "We've reviewed the footage, and there were no violations on the part of the officers involved. It's been determined that the officers acted within departmental guidelines." Jamal stared blankly at the wall in front of him, his mind spinning. The evidence didn't support his claims. There was body cam footage that he knew would show him being treated unfairly, that would show Matthews's aggression and Taylor's dismissive attitude. But it didn't matter. It never mattered. "Are you telling me," Jamal said, his voice shaking with barely contained fury, "that everything I said, everything I went through, doesn't matter? That I'm just supposed to accept this?" "I'm afraid so," Daniels said, his voice growing softer. You can file an appeal if you wish, but I should warn you, it's unlikely the decision will be overturned. I'm sorry, Mr. Williams. The words felt like a slap in the face. Jamal couldn't believe it. He felt as though he had been knocked out of his own body, watching as his efforts crumbled in front of him. The system had failed him again. No, it had never been on his side in the first place. He wasn't surprised, but the weight of it still hit him like a freight train. Thank you, Jamal managed, his voice quiet now, resigned. I'll be in touch. He hung up, staring at the phone in his hand, the silence around him suffocating. He didn't know what to do next. He wanted to fight back, to scream, to make the world see what had happened, to make people understand how unjust everything was. But what good was it? What good was fighting when the system was stacked against you at every turn? A few more days passed before Jamal heard anything else. This time, it wasn't a call. It was a letter, addressed to him from the police department. His stomach twisted as he opened it, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded the paper. The letter began with a formal apology, standard empty words meant to placate. It expressed regret for the situation, acknowledged his complaint, but then the words that followed left him stunned. After a careful review of the matter, we have determined that Officer Matthews acted within the bounds of his authority. Furthermore, while there was no violation of department policy in the way he and Sergeant Taylor handled the situation, we have concluded that the officer's actions may have been perceived as inappropriate. As a result, Officer Matthews will be receiving counseling on communication skills, and Sergeant Taylor will be receiving additional training on handling complaints. We regret that this incident occurred. That was it. Counseling and training. Nothing substantial. No justice. No consequences. Just more words. More empty promises. Jamal's anger flared again, but this time it wasn't just anger. It was exhaustion. He had given everything to this fight, and yet nothing had changed. They had brushed him aside, like they always did, like they always would. But then something unexpected happened. The news broke a few days later. Jamal had been scrolling through his phone when a headline caught his eye. Officer Matthews under investigation after allegations of racial profiling. His heart skipped a beat. He clicked on the link, his eyes scanning the article quickly. It appeared that the internal investigation had sparked public outcry. Video footage of Jamal's arrest, footage that had somehow leaked to the press, had gone viral. People were speaking out, rallying behind Jamal. The outcry was swift and loud. The department, under pressure, had no choice but to take action. Officer Matthews was placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation. Sergeant Taylor, too, was under scrutiny, and the public pressure kept mounting. It wasn't over. Not yet. Jamal didn't know what would happen next, but he felt a flicker of hope, something he hadn't felt since that night. The system may have tried to bury his voice, but now the world was listening. People were standing up for him, for his rights, and for the truth. It wasn't the victory he had hoped for. It wasn't justice in the way he had imagined it, but it was a start, a beginning. And in that moment, Jamal realized that no matter how many times the system tried to crush him, he wouldn't be silenced. The fight was far from over.